现场尊敬的各位来宾，那么接下来的时间，我们即将进入到的是今天的第一场重磅主题分享环节。企业出海欧洲第一步不是落地，而是战略。方向错了，步步皆错；战略对了，事半功倍。那么接下来要来到舞台上方的这一位嘉宾，他精通5国语言，拥有丰富的跨国拓展、人力资源转型与国际企业合作经验，长期助力中外企业实现共赢发展。下面让我们有请 Jackson Frank 创始人兼首席执行官 Mr. Pawel Michalkiewicz 来到舞台上方，为大家带来分享欧洲市场战略规划从落地到规模化增长。掌声有请。
欢迎大家。I hope everybody is doing well. I hope everybody is doing great. And I can say, before I start, I can say that I have visited last year maybe 20, 21 countries, many cities, but there is only one place I consider my second home, and that is Shanghai, and especially the Jing'an district. So thank you for having us here again. Distinguished guests, respected government officials, and business leaders, welcome to China to Europe 2026, Scaling Beyond Borders. Thank you very much for joining us today. This session is designed to be practical. You know, expanding from China into Europe brings enormous opportunity, but it also brings real complexity. Success is not only about entering a market. It is about building an organization that can operate with confidence across multiple countries, cultures, and regulatory environments. In our previous presentation, here in Shanghai, we discussed how Chinese companies are evolving from made in China to created by China. Many companies are no longer only manufacturing for the world. They are innovating, building brands, and moving closer to European customers. That shift is very, very exciting, and it deserves the right foundation. At Jackson & Frank, our role is to help these Chinese companies succeed in Europe. We do that from a workforce management and compliance perspective, so growth can happen faster, safer, and with less distraction for the leadership. If you ask any company which goes overseas, what is your strategy? What is your strategy? The answer is unlikely to be, first, we build a perfect HR process. That's not true. The strategy will be always about market penetration, product channels, and marketing. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, exactly how it is supposed to be. HR strategy is rarely the headline. While going overseas, however, it is very important. That's why today we have invited friends of Jackson & Frank, experts who have proven themselves in their field to share what works in real life. Together, we will cover the workforce, compliance and leadership challenges you will face, and more importantly, what to do about them. What is the solution? Let's begin. But before we dive into Europe, a quick story from Dubai. I've recently spent 2 periods of 2 weeks in Dubai, fortunately before the tragedy which is there right now. I can tell you that the city is constantly under development. New lanes, temporary exits, and roadblocks appear overnight. Google Maps often can't catch up, so driving from A to B, it sometimes gives you the wrong directions. Yet, navigation is still necessary. Without Google Maps, and of course, WeChat Maps, which is even better, I would never find my way. What helped in this situation was not relying on automation alone. I looked up, scanned the environment, read the signs, and followed what was in front of me. The signs reflected reality in real time, and they got me where I needed to go. That's a useful metaphor for going overseas. Digital tools are essential. Digital tools, platforms are essential, but local reality matters even more. One important point, I'm not bashing platforms or automation. Automation is absolutely the future. And the best tools are essential. They get us 80% of the way. But in fast changing environments, you still need human judgment. And you need to look up at the signs in front of you. Here are a few Dubai moments. Detours, constructions, etc. Last minute changes. The point, the environment updates faster than the app. If you only follow the screen, you can end up in the wrong lane. In Europe, HR and labor law compliance is like those road signs. It changes by country, by industry, and sometimes with a very, very little notice. In Europe, roadblocks are often intentional safeguards, collective bargaining coverage, CLAs, consultation duties, strict termination protections of employees, etc. The winning approach is a combination of a good platform and local experts. Partners who can guide you through the real-world situations. In Dubai, the lesson was, don't rely on automation alone. Look up and read the signs. The same is true for EOR, employment of record, and employment in Europe. A platform can support workflows, but a platform alone is not EOR. Management of the HR cycle, especially from legal point of view, requires more. In 2026 and in 2027, most of the European governments will increase the monitoring of international labor in Europe. This is a fact. HR companies involved can expect more audits in regard to labor and migration law compliance. Not having the right setup in place can be a big danger for your company, your brand, and all your partners in the supply chain. We want to help you to avoid that and help you with a template for a plan. But before we go there, let's look at what CEOs of some great Chinese companies have to say. The pains which Chinese companies feel based on research of KPMG, Deloitte, and our own interviews are the following. Geopolitical risk and market access barriers. Going overseas means facing challenges like import tariffs, investment screening, KYC, export controls, and political scrutiny. These aspects are making entry harder, especially in strategic sectors like EV and semiconductors. Looking at the first point, an operational example can be as simple as opening of a bank account. This is sometimes close to impossible. I will give you a real life example. It was easier for me as a Dutch citizen to open a bank account in China, here in Shanghai, than it was in France. And believe me when I say, we have done it before, because we have 27 bank accounts in 20 countries. This is probably so if you look at the second point, point 2, this is probably the most immediate operating headache. Companies now have to navigate different complex labor laws, rules on subsidies, procurement, data privacy, reporting, and rigid tax rules. Paul will tell more about the rigid tax rules in a very, very near future, I think. Laws in Europe are the most complex in the world. The third point, supply chain redesign. Many Chinese companies now need a more complicated operating model. China for China, China +1, or region-specific supply chains. That is costly, and operationally it's very messy. A consumer electronics manufacturer sets up additional production in Vietnam or Mexico to reduce exposure to tariffs on products entering the US or the EU market. Effective, but far from efficient. Going overseas is not longer just export and sell. Point 4. In many markets, firms are being pushed to localize management, branding, compliance practices, partnerships, and sometimes manufacturing. We see great Chinese companies keeping their DNA while going overseas, but also adapt a little bit in order to achieve their goals. A lot of overseas expansion, looking at point 5, a lot of overseas expansion problems are really people problems. Finding local leaders, building cross-cultural management, hiring compliance and digital specialists, and aligning headquarters with local teams. That's something Professor Yao will elaborate on during the round table, I think. Looking at EOR trends, next slide please. Allow me to briefly tell you that EOR stands for Employment of Record. As some of you may know, employment of record HR companies are taking over formal employment of the employees of the client and helping the client with labor compliance and everything related to it. The EOR companies are the formal employer and the client is the operational employer. It is a very important tool or service for companies going overseas. Therefore, let's briefly look at some trends. We noticed that the traditional EOR is shifting from a market entry tool to core HR infrastructure. Historically, you can say EOR was mainly used to test a new market before establishing a legal entity. In 2026, many companies now view EOR, look at EOR, as a permanent part of their global workforce model. What has changed? EOR used for long-term contracts, not just for temporary hires. Integration with global workforce planning. Multinationals using EOR alongside their own legal entities. Market growth remains strong in our business, in the HR EOR sector. The European EOR market is projected to reach approximately, maybe I can ask a question. Does anybody know how big the EOR market will be probably in 2026? What the projection is? Nobody? 16 billion euro. Looking at point 2, EOR as a product or service is becoming more extended. Flexibility also becomes essential in order to serve clients in an effective way. Now, while always operating within the compliance framework, of course, and in addition, the questions and expectations of the employees are becoming increasingly important. Things like pension, company car, and other secondary labor conditions are in demand, and EOR providers are obliged to act, at least if you want to stay in the game. Local governments, point 3, are requiring more and more operational involvement from staffing and service companies. This means stricter participation in certain operational processes and administrative responsibilities. We don't want that, but we are obliged by local governments to do so. Looking at point 4, and the term payroll, there is a definition gap. In one country, payroll means payment of salaries and salary administration. In another country, payroll means being responsible for the full employment relationship and compliance structure. Which definition you choose, it's semantics. But alignment between the client and the provider in advance is very important. This is to manage expectations up front. What kind of service is expected or needed? Operating payroll, even without formal employment in the EU, usually requires deeper operational involvement, legal accountability, and local compliance expertise. Point 5, stricter rules are sometimes hard to understand and to implement for companies. Help is required, and I would say, choose your partner wisely. Point 6, we have seen the rapid development of platforms which are supporting UR. A good platform can be of great help, but will not win your lawsuit. A trend based on the fact, point 7, that these companies often purely focus on their core activity and growth and outsource everything else. Mid-market companies, we see that this is the fastest size of companies growing in the kind of companies growing in the EOR market. And point 8, EOR companies work together to provide full service to clients, also from topographical point of view. We are very happy to see some of our partners here today. Okay, this will be a jump from the strategical to operational level. The increasing complexity leads to new questions which become a part of the operational reality. So here are some real case questions asked by our clients in the last 2 weeks. And believe me when I say that is only a fraction of the total of questions being asked. For instance, the first question, can we give a financial penalty to an employee in Italy? It looks like a simple yes or no question. Unfortunately, that is not the case. If you fine an employee, a certain process has to be followed, and it is only possible under some strict rules. If you don't do that, if you don't follow that process, you can have really, really big trouble with the law. The second case, when somebody gives a bone marrow transplant, can they call in sick? This is not something we hear daily, to be honest, but it really was in our mailbox a couple of days ago. The third category, can you arrange a lease card, has something to do with secondary benefits. A company car is a secondary labor condition with big tax consequences, both for the company and the candidate. From commercial point of view, you want to be able to offer this to the candidates in a compliant way. Point 4, also here working with fixed labor agreement templates works in theory. So amend the contract in France. We see many amendments which have to be done because, you know, sometimes your employee wants something changed. So you can have a fixed template. You can amend that template, but I always advise check it. Point 5 and 6 also, you know, are small examples of questions you can find in the info inbox of Jackson and Frank. Why are the authorities asking additional questions about migration in Germany? This is annoying. Yeah, I can understand that. In all European countries, the migration process is becoming more and more strict. And additional background checks of candidates are becoming common practice. Questions about pension, like question 8, non-competes, question 9, and employment premiums, question 10, are daily routine. Looking at question 11, please know that the employees in the most European countries are extremely well protected. That means that unilateral termination of labor agreement by employers can be very, very, very hard and very, very, very costly. And even more costly if you do not do it in a correct way. Do not underestimate labor laws in Europe. Labor law is, you know, as a study, it is a 4 to 5 year study per region. So you can say expertise is required, and sometimes a fast promise from our end can lead to big financial consequences. So sometimes some time is needed to explore questions that might look very simple. You know, especially when more parties are involved. These questions are just a small example. Ladies and gentlemen, going overseas starts with a good plan. And a good plan starts with a solid preparation. Having it in place will give you a competitive advantage. 3 steps. Preparation or plan, setup, and scaling up. For structure, your structure follows, of course, your strategy. But it's good to know in advance if the local environment in Europe will be receptive for your strategy. You will have to plan accordingly. As said, our plan exists of 3 stages: plan, setup, and scaling. The HR is seldom your primary process. I said it before. Look at, for instance, Geely or BYD, right? If you look at the strategy of Geely or BYD, it has probably something to do with obtaining a significant market share in car sales in a certain region, and not to have a superb HR strategy. But a superb HR strategy is, however, very relevant to support that primary goal. Therefore, when we plan stage 1, we need to take a closer look at the location. What does the go-to-market decision mean for your HR? Are there enough potential employees? How does the migration procedure look like? What are the local labor law basics? Only a few questions we should ask ourselves in advance. This is first stage. So this first stage is about making the right decisions before entering a market. For Chinese companies, overseas expansion should not start with incorporating or hiring. It should start with a clear strategic plan. Very important. Why this country and why now? Companies need to choose the right market and region based on demand, customer access, regulations, talent availability, and of course cost. The second question is, what is the right structure? A limited, joint venture, or a branch? This decision affects speed, compliance, taxation, and control. The third point is the HR growth strategy and budget. A company needs to know what type of team it needs in the first 6 to 12 months, what skills are critical, and how much local employment will really cost. Finally, it is important to decide who will act as the local director or representative. This role is not only operational, but also important for trust, governance, and compliance. Successful companies avoid choosing a market based on opportunity, but not operational readiness. You can have a good potential market, but being blocked by different laws and regulations. Use the right legal and commercial structure. For instance, make the right choice between a limited or a branch and position your company wisely in your org chart. Do not underestimate labor cost, tax, and social security obligations. Appointing the right local representative is very important. One is none. Be careful who you hire on key positions when you go overseas. Expand only with a realistic HR and compliance plan. A good plan will tell you what you can expect, not only tomorrow, but also in a couple of weeks, months, etc. Expanding too fast without it can be killing. But as Martin and I always say, my partner Martin, who is over here, co-founder, and we are both 50-50 shareholder of Jackson & Frank, we always say, if you don't feel the pain, you don't grow fast enough. So that's always a balance. Stage 2, setup. Once the strategic decisions are made, the second stage is execution. This is where the company builds the operational foundation for the new market. The first element is the legal roadmap. The company must understand what registrations, contracts, policies, and licenses are needed. The second element is payroll setup. This is one of the most sensitive areas because salary, tax withholding, benefits, and reporting must be all correct from day one. The third element is selecting the right accountant and local advisors. For many Chinese companies, local expertise is essential because local rules often differ from expectations at headquarters. We see very often that the expectations which are at headquarters in Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen differ from the reality in the European market. Another key area is onboarding. The company must decide what should be done in-house and what can be outsourced. That includes recruitment, contracts, onboarding, payroll administration, and employee support. This is the stage where companies translate strategy into compliant operation. Successful companies avoid delays in registration or legal setup. Avoid these delays. They can cause penalties. Payroll mistakes that damage employee trust. Salary everywhere in the world is a sacred thing. Please, no mistakes with salaries. Employment contracts that do not match local laws. Templates should be local and checked by local legal expert. Poor coordination between headquarters and local vendors. Weak onboarding leading to low retention and poor integration. We always say hire slow and fire fast. Take your time in hiring, and if you want to get rid of somebody, if you want to lay off, do it fast. Outsourcing too much without enough internal control. How does the work of your partner contribute to your primary process? What is the value? Good closing is important. Setup is the stage where compliance and credibility are built or lost. The third stage is scaling the operation in a controlled and sustainable way. At this point, the company is no longer only entering the market, it is trying to grow in that market. The first priority is to review the initial setup. This includes the PDCA approach, Plan, Do, Check, Act. I will tell something about it in a few minutes. The company should assess whether the structure, vendors, payroll, processes, and policies are still fit for purpose. The second priority is to optimize the organization structure and policies. What worked for 5 employees will probably not work for 50 employees and for 500 employees. And as the team grows, reporting lines, decision-making, performance management, and HR policies need to mature. The third priority is to evaluate results and compliance health. Growth should not only be measured in revenue, but also in retention, compliance, team stability, and operational quality. Finally, scaling often means building a core team supported by a flexible layer that may include contractors, temporary staff, external specialists, or regional service partners. So main risks in stage 3, or you can say what successful companies avoid. Scaling too quickly on a weak foundation. If you build a house on solid ground and not on sand. Keeping an inefficient structure for too long. Don't be afraid to make changes when required. Compliance gaps growing as headcount increases. Overdependence on vendors without regular review. Lack of local leadership and cultural alignment. Cultural alignment is very, very, very important. Poor balance between permanent staff and flexible resources. You know, scaling is not only about growing faster, it is about growing without losing control. The most difficult thing, I would say, in scale-ups. When Chinese companies go overseas, most challenges follow predictable patterns. First, they must plan correctly. Second, they must set up compliantly. And third, they must scale with control. The biggest mistakes usually do not happen in this stage. They happen in stage 1 or 2 and only become visible in stage 3. Scaling is not just about hiring more people, it is about repeating compliance correctly across countries. When companies expand internationally, growth does not mean adding headcount, it means building an operating model that can be applied consistently across multiple jurisdictions, each with its own legal regulatory requirements. A practical way to do this is to create a multi-country baseline, a common set of group-wide HR, payroll, compliance and governance policies that define your minimum global standard. This baseline creates consistency in the way the business operates and reduces the risk of making up the rules country by country. It would also help your international HR to figuratively speak the same language. On top of that baseline, each country should have local addenda. These addenda reflect the specific legal requirements that apply in that jurisdiction, such as employment contracts, probation periods, termination rules, working time regulations, mandatory benefits, leave entitlements, and data privacy obligations. For example, your global baseline may state that every employee must receive a written employment agreement, completely mandatory onboarding, and be covered by a code of conduct and data protection policy. The local addendum then defines what that means in practice. Just as important, this is not a one-time exercise. Laws change, business models evolve, and local practice develops over time. That is why companies should conduct periodic compliance reviews to test whether both the global baseline and the country addenda are still accurate, complete, and operationally effective. In simple terms, standardize what you can, localize what you must, but review it on a regular basis. You know, because international expansion is hard enough already, you do not want your compliance strategy to be copy, paste, and pray. You want it to be solid. Your strategy can be international, but believe me when I say that inspectors from the government are very, very local. So, basically, I advise everybody a good, solid compliance baseline over all the countries. For now, I want to thank you for your attention. And I don't know who the next speaker is. Thank you, thank you. 谢谢。
好的，谢谢，再一次感谢 Mr. Pawel 的精彩分享，谢谢。